Hey guys, it's Cam here. Welcome back to the build room. In this week's episode, we're tackling the rusty parcel shelf on old Violet Crumbles back there, 1976 Toyota Celica. I'm not sure how we're going to fix that yet, but at a bare minimum, we're going to be doing some sheet metal folding on the bending brake we built last week. We're also going to do some shrinking and stretching and a whole bunch of welding and grinding. Plus, we've got another chance to win in our t-shirt giveaway, and if that's not enough, it's new tool day. So stick around and check it out. Alright, so in last week's episode, we built ourselves a bending brake, and in that episode, I did say that I may need to triangulate the bottom half. I've gone ahead and done that, and I've also put some bracing underneath because the amount of pressure this was putting on when I was bending stuff was actually bending the table itself. So hopefully we've got that sorted. I'm not sure if the bending brake is going to be what we need for the first part of this repair. We definitely need it for that piece that's going to hold the windshield channel, but I'm still not sure I'm going to get sharp enough edges on this to get that outside radius appropriate for the outer windscreen sill. And if it doesn't work, there's plenty of other methods we can use, and we'll just keep trying until we find one that works. Now, before we go and have a look at that parcel shelf, I did say it's new tool day, and there's a couple of things. So firstly, if you look at the edge of the bench there, this blue thing here is a new, basically a manual shear. I'm getting a bit sick and tired of the amount of dust and stuff like that that's in here from just cutting and grinding small pieces of metal to bits and bobs. This should allow me just to cut both straight and curved shapes up to 1.2 millimeters of steel. It's a pretty basic unit. There's not really much to talk about. I got it from Hare & Forbes, if anyone's wondering, over here in Australia, and I think it was about 300, 400 bucks. It wasn't cheap, but realistically, none of these things are. But that is not the main point of conversation for new tool day. In fact, we have got all of this, which is a bunch of new Milwaukee tools. So the reason I've thrown these up here now is we're going to use a couple of them in this episode. But for certainly a few of you out there will probably be surprised to see me buying Milwaukee and not buying DeWalt. There is some reasons behind that. So I have the 18 volt, 54 volt flex volt stuff in DeWalt, and I love it. I have no issues with it. I would thoroughly recommend it to anyone looking to buy reasonable quality tools at a reasonable price. But where I do think that DeWalt has perhaps dropped the ball is in some of the peripheral market, and nowadays you need a battery for everything, and in the workshop having everything battery powered is certainly very handy. And what Milwaukee have done is really expanded their product set into a bunch of cool stuff that you can't get in the DeWalt range. So you can see here I have a 12 volt die grinder, a sander polisher, which will become very handy for me soon, and their new high speed 3/8 inch ratchet. So, you know, those are just the sort of the basic tools that I plan on using, but there's also a bunch of other things that I want. There is a tire inflator. They also have a really awesome under bonnet light. It basically clips onto either side of the bonnet. Yeah, there's just a bunch of different things that are not core to what I'm doing in the garage, and you wouldn't always suggest that, you know, if you wanted a light or an air inflator, that you're going to go to a major tool company in order to get those. But why have 10 different types of batteries in your garage? So I'm trying to keep the ecosystem as small as possible. Very happy with the 18 volt and 54 volt DeWalt stuff, but the 12 volt stuff is it's also a little bit lighter, and there's other things like that, but it just offers a market segment that I can't get to in DeWalt. None of this stuff is sponsored. It's all paid for. I have a tiny channel. No one is going to be sending me tools for free anytime soon. So I've put my own money in. Milwaukee is expensive, but I'm hoping it does the job. I have already used the die grinder a fair bit, doing the bars for the bending brake, and I've got to say, very handy tool to have. Loving it, and I think it's going to come into its own on the sheet metal stuff as well. The only thing I dislike about this so far is the way that the batteries connect. It's actually quite difficult to get them to disconnect. The DeWalts are much easier to get on and off. They might free up with time, and I think the smaller 12 volt ones are easier to get off, but just those big 6 ampere hour ones, they're a little bit more difficult. It's a little bit of a pain in the butt, but manageable in the end. So that's enough talking about tools. We'll get this stuff packed away and we'll have a look at the back of Violet Crumbles. All right, so this is the current state of the parcel shelf. You can see we still have a lot of rusty area that's gonna have to be removed just in the main structure, but also in the shelf itself. Now, there's a couple of different things that we tried. There's a patch here, which is actually hard to see. I don't mind that one too much. That was our first attempt. Like I said, it hasn't gone too badly, except the crease on the top of this bend is not tight enough. So it's rounded over more than it should be. And sort of, if I find an area that is untouched, that is sort of the sharpness of the line that we're looking for there. This is just a little bit too soft. Now, I had thought about going through and just doing some tack welds along the top of this, and that way then I can grind it down into any shape that I want and it keeps the structure. But if we're trying to do sort of this, almost the entire length of this rear window sill is what I'm going to call it, that becomes a lot harder because it's much harder to make a panel that is 900mm long and fits all this complex curve than just a tiny little patch where you've got some wiggle room and reference points around it. So I think the first thing that I'm going to do is bend up a piece of metal that's probably, I would say 400mm long for this section here. I want to basically go through and replace my old patch and get as close to here as possible. We're going to bend it on the bending brake. We're going to see how tight we can get it. And then we're also going to use the shrinker stretcher to get the profile or the shape right on both sides, right? There is an added complication in that this metal here is not flat. So that is actually concave. So it has a curve, see if we can get right down, but it has a curve that goes down in the middle and back up. So this patch was good in that it finished up sort of right in the middle of it. I think with the piece that we're going to bend from here to here, we'll also aim to finish around that bend point so that we can slightly over bend it and we'll get the shape in anyway, right? That'll probably need a bit of filler and I might try to put some curve into it, but I think that it may exceed my panel beating abilities, at least anything to do quickly. Now, if we don't get the angle right, and once we bend this up, it's just not looking good, I am going to abandon that and then we'll go to stage 2. So let's get into the bending and the shrinking and stretching now, and we'll see where we're at. Alright, so this is where we're at now. So we've done obviously all of the shrinking and stretching. I did run the hammer and dolly across here to get the curve in. I think I've got the curve in pretty much all the way along. It's probably a bit over exaggerated, but
Better to have a little bit of filler sit in there than for it to be pronounced and be thinning out the metal or thickening up this with filler. So yeah, it's pretty good all the way along. The gaps are nice and tight. The only problem I can see with it is just in this corner, this edge is down, just needs to be folded up a bit. I'll do that when I pull it out. But I think that's pretty good. What I do want to do is tack it in place, and then I want to get the stainless steel trim back in here and just check it, because I want to be 100%. If I start bad here, I'm just going to replicate that poor edge all the way through. So important to get this step right. So yeah, let's get some small tacks on it, and then we'll see where we're at. Okay, so that fit up really nicely. There is realistically no gap at all through all the way through here. There's a little bit on this end, but I shaved it back a little bit to make it easier to fit, knowing that we have to rebuild metal around here anyway. The line looks pretty good through here. So what we're gonna do now is just lay the chrome across it. Ignore this end piece. It has got a little bend on the back of it while we're taking it off. But overall, provided we are close up until about there, we should be good. And wow, that looks almost perfect. And you can see close up, that chrome is basically perfectly on. Now, obviously it won't sit this tight when the seal is in place and it's all back together, but the line should match up. So I think we're pretty good there. So before we start chopping any further down, what I want to do is rebuild this corner and clean out all the rust and stuff that's in there. So I'll probably take a reasonable sized piece out of here and replace it, hopefully all as one. Rebuild these edges here, because there's no way I'm going to put a seal back over those. Rust proof in all of these holes, and really just shore up this entire end. We'll build out these pieces here, and then we'll come back and talk about what we're going to do with the deck.
So all those pieces are in and tacked up. We welded around the edges of this one as well. Everything is looking pretty good. We have really tight gaps on most of the metal. There are some bigger gaps you can see here and over here, but those are actually areas that I ended up having to rework in some way. So I had to cut through them with the grinder, through the spot welds, and so now you've got a gap here that is the size of a grinding disc. Here, the patch panel I made didn't fit as nicely as I would have liked, but I went around and edge welded this. We'll grind those back. We'll probably have to touch it up in a few spots, but it's all looking good. So now it's time to get cracking on the parcel shelf. So we've already put a heap more strength into it here, but just to get it right, the next steps are going to be to basically just trace out the right sort of plates. I'm going to keep it really simple through here. All of this really can just be flat sheet metal, so there's no work required and not a big deal. The only areas that might require something are in these areas of a depression. And then the whole thing is going to have to be fully welded up properly, and that's going to be a very slow process because we'll basically be tack welding and then letting it cool and tack welding and letting it cool until we get it across the whole thing, and then sanded back nice and neat so you guys can see a finished product. So yeah, there's a bunch more work there to get done. While I'm doing that, it is the perfect time that if you like what you see, you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It really helps the channel out. But for now, let's get into it. All right, so everything is in place, spot welded nice and tight. The alignments are good. I'm feeling pretty happy with it so far. Now we have to go in and fill in all of these areas between the spot welds. So I have my welding gun, obviously, and then I have my air blower. And we're gonna just go through here and set up the welder as we go to put as little heat in here as possible, which doesn't mean the lowest setting, it means the lowest heat overall. So you might have a higher power and a shorter duration, just so that you can get the penetration you need without the heat. All right, so we are done. That is the closest I've ever come to rage quitting, but it is looking pretty good. I will go into this a little bit further. You can see the parcel shelf, we've finish welded all that, tied it all together, got a nice sharp edge on this. But yeah, I'm gonna take a second to tidy up, and then I'm gonna jump up to the workbench and we'll go through this in more detail. All right, so we've tidied up, I've cleaned up, I'm feeling a lot better. That was an absolute miserable exercise in frustration. I'll get into it in a second. But before I do, there's a couple of housekeeping items. First of which is the t-shirt giveaway. So back in the 50th episode, that was a long time ago now, but I did say that we were going to give away 2 t-shirts every episode for 5 episodes. This is now the 3rd episode in that, so there's still 2 more episodes to come, and all you have to do to enter is put a comment in on the episode, and it'll give you an entry into the draw, and you can win your choice of TBR shirts. If you want to see what sort of shirts we've got, you can go to shop.thebuildroom.com, but there's lots of stuff there. We've got first gen Celicas, 240Zs, 1600s, we've got 2000 GTs, there's rotaries in there, there is my A90 Supra, R34 GTR, all those kinds of cool cars. So pretty much whatever you want to represent, you can in a TBR shirt. And then second of all, I just wanted to touch back on the Milwaukee tools. So I used that grinder a lot throughout all of that sheet metal work. It did really, really well. There's a couple of little things I would change about this. It would have been nice to see a smaller distance from the edge of the roll lock to the body of the unit. It does feel a bit long and unwieldy. That probably could have been done with the addition of a spindle lock. A button on here to lock this spindle off would have been much better than having to put a tool on the end of it. And maybe even a quick release or something like that would have been cool as well. The handle grip is good, but the way that they do the lockout for it is the opposite to DeWalt. So that's a bit frustrating. I keep having to adjust one way or the other. But other than that, I'm really, really happy with it. This episode has actually taken so long for me to do that in the background I've also gone and ordered the tire inflator. So I'm super stoked about that one. I mean, I want that underhood light. They've got a cool 12 volt wet and dry vac, which is like a box with a hose you can take anywhere. They've got a awesome multi-tool, and I'm due for a new impact driver. I do want 2, so I'll keep using my old DeWalt, but having a lighter 12 volt one would be cool as well. So plenty more tools to collect. I'm sure we'll get to that. But for now, what happened with that rear end? So the best laid plans often go awry, and that is exactly what happened there. So like I said, I wanted to try bending on the bending brake a sheet of metal and then shrinking and stretching it, which we did. You saw all of that footage. It worked out really quite well. I was happy with what I was getting, and I had it all tacked in, all sitting quite nicely. And then I went to go in and fill in between the tacks. And that worked for 90% of that back area. And then in one section, it just started blowing through and it had a crack in it. Now you will have seen me using the spot welding dent puller, and that's what actually showed this up. Basically, I was going down the line and just lifting it up because it was a little low. And in one area, it actually tore. And then as I looked at it a little bit more, it was clear that the metal below my patch, so not the patch that I welded in, but below it, was paper thin. And it turned out that that was actually because there was another patch that was in there originally that I hadn't noticed. I think it might have been the one that I did in the previous episode, but nonetheless, it had cracked, and every time I tried to weld it, it just blew hole after hole after hole, and it was gonna be an absolute schmozzle if I tried to fix it like that. So I had to bite the bullet, cut that section out, and replace it, and basically completely nullify the whole point of why I was going to all that trouble of bending something on the bending brake and shrinking and stretching it. But it did come out pretty well in the end. I wouldn't say I'm 100% happy with it, more like maybe 50 to 60% happy with it, but it is structural and it'll hold, and all it really needs is a slight skim of filler and to be sanded back. Now, the question I would ask you guys is, I did replace one section, and then the section next to it looks quite ugly. Structurally it's fine, as I said, but it just doesn't look really good. Would you, if it was your car, spend the time to go back and cut that section out and replace it like I did the piece next to it? That's the question I want to hear from you guys down in the comments below, because I've done what I wanted to do, which was to get this thing structurally sound enough to put on the rotisserie, and that's what we're doing in the next episode. We're not going to keep fixing that further than it is now. Violet Crumbles is in the way and needs to go onto a rotisserie and get out of the way, but we'll eventually come back to it, and that's when I want to know whether you guys want to see me correct that issue or just move on and know that we've got a little bit of filler in that corner moving forward. Now, in terms of the repair itself, would I recommend you guys trying to do it that way? The answer is hell no. I mean, obviously my skill sets need to improve, and I learnt a lot doing this in this episode, and that's part of what this whole journey is about, figuring out how to do some of this stuff. So I don't regret doing it that way, but I would suggest to you guys just do the flat panel replacement that you weld on the edge, but make sure you can take the whole lot out, flip it over, weld up the backs of everything, and then put it in. That is the way that Fitzy says to do it. I've watched the episode where Fitzy tells you to do it that way, and I still decided to try something a little bit different and see what I could do. Like I said, I don't regret it, but Fitzy Fabrications, go and watch that video and then just do what he says. But make sure you're back next week when we get this thing onto a rotisserie. Now, if you're new to the channel, I'm going to link to the full Violet Crumbles series up here, and I'm also going to link to our RA28 Celica project down here. Other than that, I just want to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on The Build Room. Bye for now.